momentarily. So this talk is going to be recorded and it will be later uploaded to the YouTube channel of the Center for Jewish Studies at the CUNY Graduate Center. So I want to invite you all to keep your microphones muted during the talk. We're all Zoom pros at this point. After the talk, we will have plenty of time for questions. We will become very adept at using Zoom, so you all know what to do. Please feel free to use the hand raise function on Zoom, or you can type the word question in the chat box, and I'll take your questions in the order in which we receive them. And if you're unable to unmute yourself, you feel free to just type out your question and we'll read it out loud for you. So now finally, without further ado, let me introduce our speaker, Robin Judd, who is an associate professor of history at The Ohio State University, where she also directs the Hoffman Leaders and Leadership in History Fellowship Program. Her work focuses on Jewish, transnational, and gender history, with particular interests in Holocaust studies, anti-Semitism, the history of religion, the history of leadership, and the history of migration. In recognition of Professor Judd's work in Holocaust studies, Governor DeWine appointed her to Ohio's Holocaust and Genocide Memorial and Education Commission in 2021. She is the author of Contested Rituals, Circumcision, Kosher Butchering, and German Jewish Political Life in Germany, 1833-1933, that came out with Cornell University Press, and the book she's presenting today, Between Two Worlds. Between Two Worlds came out in 2023 with UNC Press, was awarded not one, but 2 National Jewish Book Awards in 2024 in the categories of women's studies and writing based on archival material. We're very excited to have you, Robin. Thank you so much for coming to the Graduate Center. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much for inviting me, Francesca. It's just delightful to be here, and it's nice too to have the opportunity to speak with a cozy kind of smaller group. I just came from a classroom of 75 students where we were doing a simulation around Title IX, and it was kind of complete and utter bedlam. And so there's something really quite lovely about having the opportunity to sit with like the number of squares that I can actually like count on my fingers and toes. So thank you all for being here, and let me share my screen. Hopefully this will work. It worked before. There we go. Perfect. So thank you all for being here today. I hope you can see the screen and hear my voice. If not, one of you can holler at me and tell me otherwise. Today I'm going to spend some time, about 30, 35, 40 minutes or so, speaking with you about my recent book project, Between Two Worlds, Jewish War Brides After the Holocaust. And I'm hoping that we'll do so by sort of moving into 3 kind of larger conversations. First, just giving you a little bit of introduction and background, and hopefully all of you can see the presentation. So again, if anyone can't, please holler at me. So first, doing a quick introduction and background, then saying a little bit about why Jewish war brides, given that there is a good...
Robin, I'm so sorry to interrupt. I think it started screen sharing, but for some reason it didn't go through. So if you want to do it again.
All right. Ooh, people are just seeing a black screen. All right, let's try it again. And let's do it. Maybe I'm going to... Can people see?
We can see.
You can see? Okay, I was making sure. Excellent. It looks like people can see. All right. So Francesca, feel free to interrupt me. As I often say to my students, like one of the joys of having raised two children is that one is easily interruptible and able to then pick up where one left off before. So today, as I mentioned earlier, what I'd like to do is to kind of give you an introduction and a background, look at why Jewish war brides, and then to talk about four people in particular, two couples, Flory and Harry, Sala and Abe. So before I kind of jump into the specificity of the people I study, I did want to reflect on what we mean when we're referring to a war bride. The term war bride is actually a term that has roots in the ancient period, referring to a soldier or officer who takes a foreign civilian as his wife, as his bride. And in terms of the countries that I study, which is the United States, Britain, and Canada, each of them developed policies around marriage of military personnel when they served abroad. Britain had the longest history of the war bride category. Indeed, in Britain, there is a development of legal code around the women on and off the regiment. This dates back to far earlier times, medieval times, when there was sort of notions of who would be supported and who would not be supported in terms of a group of soldiers. The laws around the war bride status that resembled those that I look at in the Second World War in Britain developed in the late 19th century, in Canada developed during the First World War, and in the United States, as we'll talk about, develops in sort of both World War I and World War II, and changes probably most dramatically between World War I and World War II. In terms of the war brides themselves, there are around 220,000 war brides, and one could be a male war bride. Indeed, there is a well-known American film, I Was a Male War Bride, that stars Cary Grant. So one could be a male war bride. But there are about 220,000 war brides that come to the United States after the Second World War. Most of those come from Britain and to a lesser degree from Australia and New Zealand. There are around 80,000 or so that go to Britain, and around 60,000 brides and dependents who go to Canada. Of those, a very small number are Jewish. There is wonderful literature on the war bride phenomena of the First World War and of the Second World War. That war bride literature tends not to focus on the sort of small minority groups like the Jewish war brides. And so it's hard to kind of find their narrative when looking at this incredible, really helpful literature. So to answer the question, which I always get if there's all this war bride literature, and if there were only a few, thousand Jewish war brides, why is it that you even came to this topic in the first place? There really are kind of two origin stories. The first has to do with this fabulous photograph here, a photograph that hangs in my family room at home. The woman who has the amazing sweater and who some might say looks a little bit like me is that of my grandmother. My grandmother was herself a Jewish war bride. She marries the man I knew as my biological grandfather after the war and comes to the United States as a war bride. And I always knew that story, or at least starting at around the age of 8 or 9, I knew the story. My grandmother presented her story as relatively unique. She, like many survivors, was really uncomfortable talking about her experiences during the war or the sort of her immigration story. She was very happy talking about sort of her years as a mother in Yonkers, New York. She was happy talking about her high school years in the gymnasium, but any conversation about the Second World War and the immediate aftermath was sort of off the table. And so I grew up thinking that her war bride experience was relatively unique. And when I would read sort of narratives around war brides, um, it felt to me like her story really was unique, that she must have been one of the only Jewish war brides out there. And so perhaps this was not worth focusing on outside of just being interested in my grandmother's story. But then as I began teaching the history of the Holocaust at Ohio State, I started assigning memoirs that had been written by female survivors. And one of the trends that I noticed immediately was that several of the uh, early memoirs written by Jewish female survivors were written by Jewish female survivors who married the men they met at liberation. So Gerda Weissman Klein's All But My Life is one of the most well-known female survivor memoirs here in the United States. She ends her memoir being liberated by Kurt Klein, the man that would become her husband. Leisha Rose's The Tulips Are Red is one of the first memoirs published in Canada by a Canadian Jewish survivor. Leisha Rose had been a member of the Partisans, and she meets her husband, Isaac, literally in the lines of fighting. Gina Turgel's I Light a Candle is the first memoir published in Britain by a Jewish survivor there. Gina had been in several camps and ends in being liberated in Bergen-Belsen by the man that she marries. And there are other examples as well. And I just include two of them here, but there are several others. Judith Magyar Isaacson's Seed of Sarah and Lala Fishman's Lala's Story. And it all sort of hit home in what may have been the second or third or maybe fourth year I was teaching when I decided to use the clip of the first Holocaust survivor introduced to the United States audience on a television show. And that was Hannah Kohner, who is the surprised guest on the TV show This Is Your Life. And Hannah Kohner, in her interview, talks about marrying the man that had been her childhood sweetheart, Walter Kohner, and meeting him after liberation and coming to the United States with him as his wife. And it occurred to me that clearly my grandmother, while absolutely unique, and we're all unique. I mean, as historical actors, we're all unique, but my grandmother's story might have shared other commonalities with other Jewish survivors, and I really wanted to know more. And so over time, as I began to do my research in several different countries, and I'm happy to talk about this in the Q&A, but the project sort of began as a project that was going to focus sort of only on Germany and then expanded into this transnational project that looked at North Africa and much of continental Europe of brides, and by brides, I mean men and women, because you could be a male or bride coming to the US, Britain, and Canada, that it became clear to me that these women and men offer us another way of thinking about what many of them refer to as the problem of survival in the aftermath of trauma. And absolutely, many of them talk about survivor's guilt, but there's a different set of problems that they discuss when they talk about how they survive in the aftermath of the trauma. And here we have this amazing image that comes from the Canadian Archives, Jewish Archives in Montreal, of Isaac Rose standing by his tank, by his Jeep, and Isaac was a Jewish chaplain. The the brides also tell us a lot about how very uneven and prolonged and sometimes unhappy the experiences of reconstruction and recovery could be. And we'll talk a little bit about this when we look at liberation. One of the things that I really pondered most and sat with most when I was doing my research was the many different post-war communities that Jewish war brides belonged to, and how they often felt as if, even though they belonged to these communities, that there was this sense of unbelonging, that they didn't really fit in to the other Jewish DPs or the other Jewish remigres or to the non-Jewish war brides. And yet, even though they might also often be living with or working alongside or eating with or worshiping with one group or another, they often felt like they weren't fully embraced in that group. And that was reinforced often by conversations that I might have with scholars who worked on DPs or worked on survivors, who often would refer to these women as not fully belonging kind of to their data set, right? Because these women and men's experiences were a little bit different. The project and studying these Jewish women and men made me think a little bit differently about marriage, immigration, and citizenship, because these men and women's marriages, immigrations, and citizenships were overseen and dictated by a different set of policies than other survivors. And so, as we'll see when we talk about marriage and immigration, if a member of military personnel wanted to marry abroad, it would be a different process than, let's say, if two DPs wanted to marry, or if two members of the military personnel wanted to marry one another. And so in the book itself, I study 5 moments. And in the next sort of 20 minutes, maybe less, I'll kind of show this narrative arc using 2 couples as examples. So I begin the book with liberation. And one of the things that was really important to me was to show that liberation doesn't begin for everyone in 1945, that it begins for some sooner, it begins for some later, that it very much depends on time and place. I then move into the book to encounter how is it that these couples meet in the first place. I then move to the questions of courtship and marriage. How do we get from an encounter where a couple might not even share the same language, where they might meet at a camp as it's being liberated? How do they get from there to what one might call courtship, to actually getting married? I wanted to better understand what immigration looked like for the war brides, especially since the US, Britain, and Canada were so heavily involved in the immigration process. And then I end with a chapter on the acculturation and early lives of these couples. And so for the rest of the time, I'm going to be looking at 2 couples that I focus on in the book. The way the book is set up is that every chapter begins with 2 couples, and some of the couples we see with more frequency than others. I tended to think about which couples to use that would throw into relief or further demonstrate how different the experiences that I was trying to discuss in a particular chapter could be. And Florrie and Harry, Sala and Abe, while they don't get focused on in every single chapter, here they work very well because their experiences were really different. Florrie and Harry meet in Bari, Italy in 1944. Sala and Abe meet in northern Germany, in Hanover, in September of 1945. So let me just say a bit about the war brides, Florrie and Sala, and then I'll kind of take us through these moments in time. So Florrie Cabillo Yagoda is might be a name that some of you recognize. She was a very well-known Ladino folk singer here in the United States. My children thought I had made it when I was able to interview Flora Yagoda because they grew up singing her Ocho Candelitas song for the Jewish holiday of Hanukkah. Flori was born in Sarajevo, but grows up with her mother and stepfather in Zagreb. When the Nazis occupy Yugoslavia, and I should really say when the Nazis and their allies invade Yugoslavia, she and her mother and stepfather quickly flee south to Split. That was not unusual among many of the Jewish refugees because Split was being controlled by the Italians, and the Italians had the reputation of not enforcing as harsh of measures against Jews as the Germans in the north. In Split, though, they found themselves under a fair number of restrictions and were forcibly deported by the Italians to Cursula, an island in the sea, where there were two major internment camps set up. And it's there that Florey spends much of the war, thinking, in fact, that they would stay there throughout the entirety of the war, but they are evacuated in the fall of 1943 by the British and some partisans as the Germans are making their way into and through parts of Italy and are gaining hold in certain parts of Yugoslavia, or what at that point is now the divided Yugoslavia. And so they are forcibly evacuated to Bari. At that time, Bari is under British control, but the areas around Bari are not. And so for much of 1943 and early 1944, Flori and her family are liberated, but they are terrified that Bari will be overtaken by the Germans. Sala's story is very different than that of Flori. Sala begins her wartime story in 1939. In September of 1939, as the Germans invade, they invade a part of Poland where Sala is living. Sala Solart-Bonder lives in Serak. She and her family evacuate to Warsaw. They think that they will be safer there as the Germans are invading in that September of 1939 moment. She has some older siblings living in Warsaw. And when they arrive in Warsaw, they actually find that Warsaw can't accommodate the entire family in one place. And so the family splits up. It will be in Warsaw that Sala and her family are interned in the ghetto. She is eventually forcibly deported to another ghetto in Lublin. From Lublin, she is deported to Majdanek, and then Auschwitz, Ravensbrück, Tachau, and eventually she is forced on a death march where she is liberated in April of 1945 outside of Auschwitz, and she is liberated by the Soviets. Now, how each of these couples meets throws into relief one of the larger arguments of the book, and that is that for many of the couples I study, not all, but for many of the couples I study, there's a way in which their encounter narrative seeks to place Jewishness on a map that had been imagined to be devoid of Jews. To use sort of Alon Confino's language of a world without Jews, these couples and most of the couples are Jews marrying Jews. Some of the couples are Jewish survivors marrying non-Jews. But most of the couples, whether they're intermarried or not, will talk about sort of the Jewishness of the moment, whether it is a couple that meets literally at a liberated campsite or a liberated death march site, or it's a couple that meets on the street where there may be a mezuzah on the doorpost, one of the ritual objects that would be affixed on the doors of homes of observant Jews, right? There's a way in which couples think about their encounters through lenses of Jewishness. And we, of course, know that in hindsight, right, there's a way in which people fashion or create narratives around encounters, and we can talk about that in the Q&A. But Florrie and Harry, Sala and Abe each cast their encounters through kind of a Jewish meeting, and both of them revolve around the Jewish holidays that fall in the fall, namely Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. Sala and Abe meet at Rosh Hashanah services in the Hanover DP camp. Sala actually had been quite wary about the services and Rosh Hashanah more generally. She had tried to illegally immigrate to Palestine in the summer of 1945 and is thwarted in her attempt to do so. She's forced to return to the DP camp in Hanover. And it's there on Rosh Hashanah morning where, worrying that she's going to be kind of gazed at by other soldiers as if she's a monkey in a cage, she meets Abe Bonder, who she kind of sympathizes with, because here is this sort of clumsy Canadian soldier, a fervent Zionist, and also a Yiddish speaker. Abe was able to sit down and speak with Sala in flawless Yiddish. He was the son of a kosher butcher in Montreal. He grew up speaking Yiddish, both to his parents, but also to his many of his parents' clients. And so he's able to talk to her in Yiddish. Florrie and Harry have a very different kind of meeting. They meet at the base in Bari when Harry arrives. Harry has been told that there is a dance that evening for officers. He asks the pretty attractive Florrie whether she'd go with him. She doesn't even understand the question because he speaks in a mix of English and thinking that she is a refugee, perhaps some Yiddish, which he did have, and a teeny bit of Italian. She has a little bit of Italian, but she doesn't speak Yiddish. She speaks Ladino, she speaks Croatian and Serbian. But she has no Yiddish. And so eventually, with enough translators in tow, she understands the question. She tells him that she couldn't possibly go to a dance with anyone without her father's permission. They go to her stepfather, and on the table there is a machzor, the prayer book for the high holidays. And it's at that moment that that Harry realizes that Florrie is Jewish and asks if she is, and they go to the dance, albeit with Florrie's mother and stepfather in tow. So encounter stories, could be in all kinds of places: worship services, Zionist youth meetings, on the streets, in cafes, at Liberation. And I was curious, how do they go from there to courtship and marriage? Because, of course, in many of these cases, the couples don't speak the same language. The survivor might be taken to a hospital or to another site. Like, how do they get to courtship? And I sort of tended to have to rely on a number of different sources, just piece together how was it that the couples moved from those initial meetings where there may or may not have been attraction, where there may or may not have been some sort of spark or kinship or recognition of some sort of shared something, to making the decision to marry. And in the second and third chapters, I talk about kind of the different ways in which couples tried to spend time together, whether it's by writing letters or going to Zionist youth meetings or taking walks. In some cases, the courtship was very short. In some cases, they decide to marry within days. But deciding to marry, as I point out in the book, and marrying are two very different things. So in one case, for example, I mentioned Gina Turgell earlier. Gina and Norman decide to marry within a week of being in Bergen-Belsen, but the British government had very clear policies around marriage. And in order to receive permission to marry, members of the military personnel have to get their commander's permission. That requires a whole host of paperwork. That requires interviews, often by the chaplains. In many cases, it requires chaplain's approval, which is why the chaplain's papers are so important in this research. In some cases, it requires birth certificates or some kind of ID paper of the civilian spouse. In many cases, it requires some kind of medical exam. So there's kind of a whole process by which people would apply to marry. And then if that then gets approved, there's then a mandated lag time. And it's only after that that the marriage can be officiated. And in different times and places, there are different policies around who is to officiate at these weddings. And so I try in the book to kind of talk about that complexity of the marriage question. Florrie and Harry, Sala and Abe have two entirely different trajectories. For Florrie and Harry in Bari, Italy, there are almost no restrictions in terms of their fraternization. He is able to spend time with other refugees and DPs without any problems. He submits the paperwork for them to marry, and it goes through flawlessly, even though there are a whole sets of papers that Florrie lacks. And after waiting the lag time, the mandatory lag time, they are married by an American Jewish chaplain. Sal and Abe have an entirely different story. Abe is a Canadian military personnel in northern Germany in September of 1945 and October of 1945. When he learns of his demobilization, he begins to apply for permission to marry, and the Canadians' policy still prohibits marriage between Canadian soldiers and anyone on German soil. And so for Florrie, for Sala and Abe, even though they're able to have a relatively successful courtship, that successful courtship is limited to the DP camp because of the anti-fraternization rules outside of the DP camp. And they're really only going to be able to marry after Abe is demobilized, returns to Canada, and eventually plots with friends of his and other sort of fellow Zionist and NGO workers in Hanover to smuggle Sala to France. Abe will eventually return to France. They'll marry there, go to Palestine, spend time there, and from Palestine, go to Canada. So immigration, as you could see, could be really complicated. The war brides and in some cases war fiancés had their immigration overseen by the US, Canadian, and British governments. And in all three countries, there were categories that would circumvent already existing categories for immigration. So in the case of the US, which is the last of the three to pass this special kind of immigration, it does so in December of 1945, there are opportunities for war brides to take advantage of public state-sponsored travel, which would mean that the war brides would travel on war bride ships, or as we get into the latter part of the 1940s, on war bride planes. These are not ships that are only filled with war brides, but these are ships that are outfitted to be able to carry women and children. And so if a war bride or a war fiance is to immigrate, let's say from uh, uh, Prague, let's use one of our brides from Prague as an example, that would require several steps. The war bride's papers would be approved. She would go from Prague to either British occupied or American occupied Germany, depending on where she was going to be immigrating to. And then she would go from there to a war bride clearing center. There are several war bride clearing centers across Europe. Some are very, very large, like in Britain, France, and Germany. Some are small, like in Naples, Italy. But these are all spaces where war brides are cleared separately from other individuals who are immigrating or from demobilized soldiers. So at the cigarette camps, and they're called the cigarette camps, these are camps that the US military kind of rebuilds in 1944 and 1945 outside of Paris by Le Havre. These camps will have some of them set aside specifically for war brides, but then in other spaces you might find Jewish DPs, or you might find demobilizing soldiers. So these groups may kind of mix with one another, but the war brides are cleared separately, and then the war brides live with other war brides on the ships. And in the case of war brides going to the US and to Canada, there are war bride immigration programs that will create programming for them. So the American Red Cross and the War Brides Bureau creates cooking classes, film classes. There are classes about American and Canadian currency, classes about fashion, and these take place both on the ships, but also earlier in the clearing spaces as well. I should say, before I jump into these women arriving in their new homes, these women and men arriving in their new homes, that one of the chapters in my book is dedicated to those individuals who receive permission to immigrate, but then the immigration permission is rescinded. So while 98% of the people that I study eventually arrive in the homes of their spouses in the US, in Britain, or in Canada, there is a small number of individuals who receive permission to immigrate, but then that permission is rescinded, and they may never be able to make the US, Britain, or Canada with their spouses their home. And I talk about those stories in the book as well. So after immigrating to the US, Britain, or Canada, the war brides or the war fiancés almost always settle in the homes of the military personnel that they've married. And usually these homes are not actually the homes of the military personnel, but the homes of their families. So in most cases, the war brides are settling into the homes of the parents, in some cases, the siblings of the individuals they've married. In about 40% of the cases that I look at, the war brides go to the United States, Britain, or Canada before their spouses are demobilized. And then about 60% of I would say 50% or so go after their spouses are demobilized, and the rest actually go with their spouses themselves. That took place. Sometimes the spouses were lucky enough to travel together. Often that was if the demobilized soldier or officer had the wherewithal to pay for his spouse's travel. And in those cases, we often saw them flying. And I do, like in Lala Fishman, I mentioned her at the beginning of the book, the beginning of the talk. She and her husband fly to LaGuardia, and that's how she immigrates to the US. So in most cases, they're coming into homes where they may not speak the language, like we discussed with Flori and Harry, right? She arrives and in her green leopard skin suit that was kind of purchased special for her arrival into the United States. And she looks nothing like the other Jewish women in Youngstown, Ohio. She doesn't speak English. She doesn't speak the Yiddish that her husband, Harry, who goes by Heschele in his family, speak, right? The music is different. The food is different. And so for her, right, that acculturation narrative was extremely difficult. In her family's case and in Sala and Abe's family's case, the families were generally pleased that their sons had married women abroad. In some cases, the families were tremendously displeased. In some cases, the families tried to prevent the marriages from taking place. And so one can only imagine, what was it like to settle into a home where they don't only kind of not understand what's around them, but where they also know that their mother-in-law tried to prevent her son from marrying them. And so that sort of early day could be quite complicated. I talk in the book about the kind of what I find to be the fascinating binary or the fascinating paradox about this moment of unbelonging. Because on the one hand, many of these Jewish war brides feel as if they don't belong in, other war bride circles or in other survivor circles. But on the other hand, they're able to take advantage of both, of having access to both of these. And so one of the things that struck me so much when I was doing my research was the ways in which many of the Jewish war brides I studied took advantage of the multiple kind of resources available to them. They might have taken childcare classes with, other war brides and mostly Christian war brides in Brooklyn, but they may have taken English speaking classes sponsored by the National Foundation, by the National Jewish Women's Organization in National Council of Jewish Women, also in Brooklyn, right? Like, so they may have kind of hedged that. Another way in which, we see them taking advantage of both is that in many of the cases, the Jewish war brides that I study are able to take advantage of the healthcare system in ways that it might take other survivors a little bit longer. So some of the early diseases and illnesses that manifest themselves in 1945, 6, 7, 8, upon their arrival, often they're more quick to be able to get certain kinds of medical care. Now that often rests on issues of class, and in a kind of, in the book, I deal with that kind of with more nuance and don't just cast sort of this wide brush here. But that was another piece of the acculturation narrative. Another sort of thing, and maybe I'll end here because I did reference citizenship before, but one point that I mention in the book is the ways in which the war brides are often pretty quick to and more successful at being able to bring family members, if they're lucky enough to have family members in Europe, to the US, Britain, and Canada, if indeed they have the wherewithal to do so. That's a process that they're able to go through. And because they're married to members of military personnel, they're able to get their citizenship sooner. And so that's something that I look at. So perhaps I'll end with this image of Sala and Abe outside of Bonder's books. Soon after 1948, I'm sorry, they leave the state of Israel, and they eventually get to Canada, where they remain. So I will stop there and see if people have questions. Oh, look, my Dr. Fater is on the call. That's so nice. Now I didn't even know to be nervous. So please, so if there are any questions.
Thank you so much, Robin. So feel free, if you're unable to unmute yourself, just type out your question in the chat box, or signal in any way that you can, whether you have a question. But maybe I'll just start with a question on
the success rate of these marriages. And also if you were able to trace descendants and how, you started your talk saying, this is something known in my family. I thought it was unique, but my grandmother didn't really talk about that aspect, right? There were other aspects. So were you able to talk to descendants, and what was their understanding and relationship to their grandparents' story?
So I'll answer that first, and then I'll move to your question about kind of success. So certainly I did interview for the book some children of these couples. In some cases, the couples themselves that I was able to interview asked, suggested that I talk to their children. In some cases, I spoke with the children first. In fact, one of my first events in New York at the New York Public Library was Ann Kirshner and I had the opportunity to talk. And I interviewed Anne for the book, and her mother, Sala Kirshner, who's not Sala Bonder, different Sala, but whose papers I used at the New York Public Library. Anne wrote a memoir about her mom. So there's so there were children and grandchildren I spoke with in advance of the book. What has struck me, and I guess what I wasn't expecting, and I don't know why I wasn't expecting it, but I just wasn't, was the number of children and grandchildren that I've heard from since the book has come out. So I've heard from so many individuals whose families didn't make it into the book, but whose papers I have. I mean, I made sort of the difficult choice of whose stories to focus on, and there's materials in some cases of other people in the footnotes, and in some cases they just, they're in the, in my box or on the files on my computer. So that has really been remarkable and has made me think that I should, create a club or something of granddaughters of war brides. It's mostly been women, although there have been some men that have reached out to me. And at my book launch, 2 children of war brides came to the book launch, one of whom drove, a couple of hours to attend the launch because he had heard about the book and had thought his parents' story was really unique because all of the war brides that he knew about were the wives of his dad's army buddies, and nobody was Jewish. So he just sort of assumed that his mom was unique. And it turned out that, yes, she was, but there were also other ways in which she was similar. The question about kind of success always makes me smile. And it makes me smile because marriage is hard, right? I mean, I love my husband. He's not on the call. I don't think my in-laws are on the call, but marriage itself is difficult, and all the more so, I think, for couples that are bringing with them all kinds of baggage. And one set of baggage that I didn't talk about today, of course, is the traumas that each of these individuals is bringing in, right? Our military personnel who have fought and our war brides who have survived the attempted genocide. So certainly, there's that. And yet, when I compare, and I have not done the kind of detailed social scientific work that would be required if I were to actually publish something on this. But when I trace the couples that I study and those that don't make it into the book, right, into and through the 60s, 70s, and 80s, there are very few cases of divorce. There are absolutely some cases of divorce, but very few of them. And I'm assuming that some of that has to do with the fact that there just aren't many places for these survivors to go. Does that make it a successful marriage? I don't know. I think it depends on how we define success. The American and Canadian Red Cross sponsored briefly a program that allowed war brides to return to Britain. This was done after, in the US, there was a pretty well-known kidnapping case, and in Canada, there was a murder case. They take place within about the same year. And so there's, I'm working on an article on this right now. There's this program that sort of allows for these women to if they want to go back home. And so there's a fair number of women, again, we're not talking thousands, but dozens, who go back to London and Dublin, and to a lesser degree to Berlin, but mostly they're going back to England. Some go back to Paris. And it's mostly women. Hopefully nobody on the call is from like Saskatchewan, but they're mostly, or, from Iowa, but it's like these women who are kind of have urban identities, who find themselves in rural areas, and are kind of vastly dissatisfied with their lives. I don't know whether these Jewish war brides were satisfied with their lives, but they're not going to take advantage of this program. They're not going back to Poland, right? I mean, that's not an option for them. And so on the whole, I see them staying married. Again, there are some cases of divorce. In all cases but one, the divorces take place after the children are grown. In one case, I have a divorce while the children are still young.
Thank you. Do we have other questions? Abby?
Hi, thank you so much, Robin. First of all, I'm just fascinated by the research. I'm curious to know when did you start researching the book, and how long did it take you before, from idea, researching, to publishing the book?
So that's a hard question to answer, in part because many years ago, I had the idea of starting something on this, and it would have been the wrong time, because I don't think I didn't have the space and yet the kind of depth to be able to do a transnational project and to be able to pick up as many different disciplines as this project required me to. So in some ways, this made a great second book. It had been an idea in my head for a long time. It would come in, it would come out. And certainly once I finished the first book, I knew that this would be what I would want to write. So it took a long time, right? The first book came out in like 2007, 2008. After the book came out, I sort of was wrapping up various things with that book. And then I began this project. At first, I thought I would try to contain it and look only at survivors who were in Germany. Part of that had to do with my language skills. Like, I'm most comfortable in German and in Hebrew. And then I realized that I was just going to have to force myself and use some of my other languages, or at least ask for friends for help. So almost all of the Polish sources here were translated with help. I have no Polish. I knew what words to look for, right? But whereby, I couldn't speak French to save my life. If you write it down, I'm fantastic. And so found myself, writing things in French, and then having the archivist writing things back and then looking at documents. I relied heavily on various networks. And by that, I mean, I sent out kind of help classified kind of things, calls in, the Jewish war veteran magazines and newspapers, in Hadassah, in all the major, like the New York Jewish News, the Montreal Jewish paper, Miami Jewish paper. So I heard from Toronto. So I heard from a number of families because they saw that sort of ad. And then there were kind of the archives. I knew I would find materials if I started with the chaplains. So a lot of the materials I used were Jewish chaplaincy records, and then I began to kind of like pull the threads. So great second book, horrible first book. In that, again, the reality, the academic reality is you only have a certain amount of time to get that first book done, whereby at Ohio State, I'm sure they would have been happier if I had finished the book sooner, but it wasn't ready yet. And again, I go back to having the confidence that I don't know that I would have had as a graduate student, because your first book is essentially your dissertation, to be able to say, okay, I'm going to have to learn, Canadian history. I'm going to have to learn military history, legal history, like, the amount of legal history I had to learn and immigration history, I'm going to have to figure out Flemish, right? Like, so that would have been a nightmare if I had been staring down the tenure clock, versus with this book where I kind of could allow myself to think about these different disciplines.
Well, the detail is just incredible. I mean, and just even, it was so nice I have the book and I'm not finished yet, but the detail, and then just to talk, like how you spoke about the dress, the green dress, and there was a machzor on the table. I was like, whoa, it just kind of brought it to life. It was amazing. And then I just have one more quick question. You mentioned earlier about the woman who your kids were impressed when you interviewed her because they know a song, a Hanukkah song.
Yeah.
I'm just thinking that might be a fun thing to bring up this Hanukkah to kind of, bring more young people to share the story with them.
That's a great idea.
Yeah. So
I'm
not sure which song you're referring to, but I would love to learn more about that. If you can drop it in the chat, or
I'm going to misspell it because, of course, one language I don't have is Ladino, but it's Flori. Oh, it should be Yagoda, not Pagoda. There you go. Ocho Candelicas.
Candles. Oh yeah. Okay. See, now I want to go listen to that and share with my kids. So thank you for that.
Thanks.
Future of your business.
Are there any other questions?
More time and more growth.
Sorry, my internet has been taken over by an evil voice. Do we have any other questions for Professor Judd? I see Todd. Todd, would you like to unmute yourself?
I muted myself now. So I'm curious, Robin, about once these couples came and wed and settled down, how integrated into the Jewish community did they become? I mean, we know that some Holocaust survivors, they never wanted to have anything else to do, nothing to do with Jews ever again. They just wanted to go on with their lives. But these people that you're talking about are people who married, let's call them typical American or British Jews. But how do they fit into their communities?
Thanks so much, Todd, for the question. So on the whole, and there are some important exceptions, but on the whole, they tend to live pretty Jewish lives. They tend to have a fairly high rate of affiliation with some kind of Jewish institution. So in some cases, they don't belong to a synagogue, although like Flori Yagoda does, but they may belong to a workman circle, or some kind of Yiddish speaking organization, a Jewish Landsmannschaften, for example. So it kind of depends on how we think about their kind of Jewish lives. In terms of religious observance, there I see a bit more of a spread, although again, I think there is a disproportionate attempt to live some kind of Jewish life. And there's something about these they're mostly Jewish military personnel. And part of that has to do with how marriage works, which is the chaplain is still involved in officiating in the marriage. Oh, thanks, Francesca. The chaplain is still involved in approving and officiating in the marriage. And so that means that there are many chaplains, not just Jewish, Catholic and Protestant, who don't approve of intermarriage. And so on the whole, we tend to see more Jews marrying Jews, Catholics marrying Catholics, Protestants marrying Protestants during the Second World War. And so there's something about that marriage that leads to this desire for an affiliated Jewish life. It might not be with the survivor community. And to use the Kirshner example, that's a great example where Sid Kirshner, who is a kind of first generation American, does not want Salah to be living in a survivor community, or to daven at a survivor synagogue. He wants their family to be affiliated with, more kind of middle class, not Yiddish speaking Jewish lives. And she even, in her interview and in Anne's interview, there's like recollections of which beaches they would go to in the summer, right? Her dad didn't want to go to the beach where other survivors were and where there might be Yiddish spoken. He wanted to go to the part of Rockaway where everybody spoke English, right? So it plays out in these sort of interesting ways.
Any final questions? If not, I see a question in the chat.
Oh, yes, sorry. The question relates to what I mentioned about the children, grandchildren. The question is, what kind of impact has the book had on bringing these families together, or their senses of the family? It's a great question. I don't know. I can say that in some family cases, it's encouraged kind of sharing of genealogical material or kind of background stories. I'll even say in my own family, there's been a way in which my children who had a narrative of the family, now kind of having read the conclusion, asked the question, like pulled up the ITS records, they're thinking about, my family's narrative differently. So, but I don't know yet. Although I'm starting to hear about it. So thanks for the question.
Any final questions? If not, I just want to thank again Professor Robin Judd for such an illuminating talk and the beautiful book. Again, let me put it in the chat. If you came a little later, there is a discount code that UNC Press is giving if you still need to buy the book. So if you buy directly for UNC Press, you can get a 40% discount on it. And I also want to mention our next meeting, the next seminar organized by the Center for Jewish Studies at the CUNY Graduate Center is on April the 4th, at the same time online, and we will be hosting Tafata Cohen-Bick, who will talk about literary depictions of fear in Musar literature in early Hebrew letters. So thank you again. Thank you, Robin. Thank you all for coming. And I hope to see you again soon. Have a lovely day. Thank you.